Welcome to our Spotlight Matthew for today. I mention regularly that this is a devotional study series, and let me simply remind us that those two words are intentional. First of all, it is a study series. In this, we try to give you a little bit of insight or perhaps background to each of the passages that might illumine the meaning of the passage as you apply it to your life. And we want you to think of this in terms of studying the scriptures for the sake of the scriptures as the inspired word of God. And yet on the other hand, there's this devotional aspect. We want very much for these studies to apply to your life, to suggest points where these texts still come into intersection with where you are living your daily life as you seek to experience Jesus and as you attempt to walk the faith day in and day out. We come today to a passage in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33, which we might call storm at sea again. Storm at sea again, because Jesus already has had one interlude with his disciples with a storm at sea. We found that back in chapter 8, verses 23 to 27, if you want to review that. And of course, that was the passage where they are out on the Sea of Galilee and the winds rise and the waves are lapping over the edge of the boat. The disciples are terrified, but Jesus is asleep in the stern. They wake him up. Lord, don't you care if we're going to perish? He gets up and tells them that they should not be people of little faith, but should have trust in God because Christ is with them. And then he calms the sea and the wind to show his mastery even over the laws of nature. Well, we come to a second storm at sea today. And to set the scene, remember, Jesus has just learned that John the Baptist has been beheaded, and Jesus is in his humanness shaken, struck in the gut like a gut punch to him, and he attempted to get away for some time to be alone with the Father in light of this great loss and its implications. But the crowds hound him. They follow him wherever he goes. Jesus has compassion for them, and then we read of the feeding of the 5,000. Well, the crowds have been sent away after that feeding, and now we pick up this narrative with Jesus still having in his mind very much so the gruesome and horrific death, which was John's lot at the hands of Herodias and Herod Antipas. So, chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go before him to the other side of the lake, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began sinking, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Well, as we pick up this particular narrative, we see, of course, Jesus did spend that time alone with the Father following the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 and his receiving the news of John the Baptist's execution. And upon finishing that, he had sent the disciples ahead. It says that it was the fourth watch of the night. That's somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And so the disciples had been wrestling with the wind and the waves for a long period of time. Some commentators say that they may have been somewhere around 3 to 4 miles out at sea when Jesus comes approaching them in the midst of the storm. Well, they had been terrified by the difficult situation at sea, but now they're doubly terrified because they think they see a specter, some kind of a phantasm, something preternatural walking out on the sea. And indeed, they cry out and say, "It's a ghost." And Jesus immediately, of course, calms them and says, "Do not be afraid, it is I." Now, we're going to leave out the Peter portion momentarily and come back to that and jump to the end of the segment, that as Jesus and Peter get in the boat, immediately the wind calms and therefore the waves would be allayed at the same time. And watch and see what the disciples do. They bow down and worship Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And it's interesting to see what they do here because it's a little bit of a growth and development from what happened in the last storm at sea. For at the end of that they said, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" True enough. But this time they say, "We worship you, and truly you are the Son of God." They have grown from seeing Jesus as some kind of superhuman being of some sort, that he is able to master the laws of nature and the forces of nature, to acknowledging that he has some sort of unique relationship to God. And to underline that they mean this, they bow down and worship him. Now, rule number 1 for any good practicing Jew was the first and second commandments. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not then make an idol and bow down and worship it." And therefore, the disciples would have known that as good Jews, they dare not worship anything but God, and yet we find them here bowing down in the boat in worship to Jesus. And I think that's something for us to apply to our lives. We are to have the same sense that, yes, we know that Jesus was a man, he had a fully human nature without sin, but he also was the second person and is the second person of the Trinity with a fully divine nature as well, and therefore he is worthy to be worshipped. And that was one of the great breaking points between earliest Christianity and Judaism, when the earliest Christians said, "We worship God and we worship Jesus," and see no contradiction between the two of those. In fact, we see it as a greater faithfulness to the worship of God to include worshiping Jesus. That indeed is a distinctive mark of Christianity and should be a distinctive mark in our worship life as well. Now, let's jump from there to Peter, who walks on the water. He sees the wind, he doubts and begins to sink, and Jesus reaches out and grabs him. There's so many different interpretations of whether this was a good thing, a bad thing, a mixed bag, or whatever it may be. I'm going to choose to suggest to you 3 points that are positive about what happens here. First of all, Peter steps out in faith. And he's the only one who steps out in faith. And I think God honors it when we do step out in faith. And we can pattern after Peter this willingness to take risks for God with Jesus. Secondly, we do indeed see that Peter faltered. And we are going to falter. If we take the risk of faith, we are going to falter in faith. If we never take a risk in faith, we'll never falter in faith. And I think Jesus would much rather have us take those risks, knowing that we will succeed sometimes and we will fail at other times, but we will grow in our faith for the effort. And third and finally, we see that Jesus grabs Peter by the arm and is there for him as he falters and falls. And I think we need to know that about Jesus too. Even when our faith fails, even if we do act with little faith on occasions, he will indeed rescue us, bring us to safety, and indeed give us further opportunities to step out in faith, take risks for Jesus in the future, that we might continue to grow in our faith. So maybe we need to ask ourselves, where is Jesus asking me to risk in faith, even knowing that I might fail sometimes, and he will love me even when I do. That's good Spotlight Matthew for today. Read the text yourself, meditate, and pray always that God would speak to you by his Spirit. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.